In October 1929, a man named Harold Fletcher walked into his bank in Cincinnati with $847 in savings, the result of 11 years of working double shifts at a steel mill. He walked out with nothing. The bank had failed overnight. Within 6 months, Harold had lost his house, his car, and his sense of direction in a world that seemed to have forgotten how to function. But Harold did not starve. He still went to the movies on Saturday nights. He still bought aspirin when his back ached. He still needed a haircut every few weeks, and the barber down on 3rd Street was still there, scissors in hand, ready to take his 35 cents. What Harold experienced was the paradox of the Great Depression, and it is one of the most fascinating economic puzzles in American history. While the stock market collapsed by 89%, while 9 banks shuttered their doors, while a quarter of the working population stood in unemployment lines that stretched around city blocks, certain industries not only survived, but in some cases, genuinely thrived. The numbers are almost impossible to believe. Between 1929 and 1933, the United States economy contracted by nearly 30%. 15 million Americans were out of work. Entire industries evaporated almost overnight. And yet, some sectors found a way not just to hang on, but to grow, innovate, and in a few cases post their best numbers in history. Before we get into the list, I have to warn you that number 7 is going to genuinely surprise you. Number 3 will challenge everything you thought you knew about hard times and human behavior. And number 1 is the single most counterintuitive story of economic survival in the entire history of the 20th century. If you have not subscribed yet, do it now, because this channel goes deep into the economic history that your textbooks skipped. Number 25 is where we begin, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. Number 25 was the tobacco industry, and before you dismiss it as obvious, consider that economists at the time absolutely predicted it would collapse. Cigarettes were a luxury, they argued. When people have no money, they stop smoking. The data said otherwise. Per capita cigarette consumption in the United States actually increased slightly during the Depression years, hovering around 500 cigarettes per person per year, even at the depths of the crisis. The reason was psychological before it was economic. Smoking was cheap enough that even unemployed men could afford a pack of Camels for 13 cents. And in a world stripped of almost every other small pleasure, that small ritual of lighting up became enormously important. Tobacco companies like R.J. Reynolds and American Tobacco Company held their market positions with remarkable stubbornness throughout the era, and the industry employed hundreds of thousands of workers in the Carolinas and Virginia, who kept their jobs while neighbors in manufacturing cities lost everything. Number 24 was the funeral industry, which sounds morbid until you understand the economics. Death does not negotiate with recessions. The death rate in the United States did not decline during the Depression, and in some years it ticked upward due to malnutrition, suicide, and stress-related illness. Funeral homes were often small, family-owned operations that had been serving communities for generations, and families would make extraordinary financial sacrifices to bury their dead with dignity. Even families with almost nothing would pool resources for a proper funeral. The industry adapted by offering more affordable options and payment plans, but it never experienced the kind of freefall that hit manufacturing, construction, or retail. Number 23 was the candy industry, specifically cheap candy, and this connects to a broader pattern you will notice as we move through this list. When people cannot afford real treats, they buy very inexpensive treats. A penny candy was not a luxury in the traditional sense. It was an accessible moment of sweetness in a life that had very few. Companies like the Curtis Candy Company, which made Baby Ruth bars, actually saw strong sales throughout the Depression because a nickel candy bar was a small, affordable indulgence that even hard-pressed families could occasionally justify. The psychological need for comfort and small pleasures did not disappear when the economy collapsed. If anything, it intensified. Number 22 was the radio industry, and this is one of the most important entries on the list because it illustrates the substitution effect at its most powerful. When Americans could no longer afford to go to restaurants, theaters, or sporting events, they stayed home and listened to the radio. Radio ownership in American homes grew from about 40% in 1929 to over 60% by 1933, even as the overall economy contracted sharply. The content was free once you owned the set, and the set itself became one of the most justified purchases a struggling family could make. Networks like NBC and CBS actually expanded their programming during the Depression, and advertising revenue, while volatile, proved far more resilient than most industry observers expected. The radio was the Great Depression's internet, the technology that connected isolated, frightened people to a larger world and gave them something to do that cost nothing after the initial investment. Number 21 was the dry cleaning industry, which survived for a reason almost no one anticipated. When you cannot afford to buy new clothes, you take extraordinary care of the clothes you have. The average American family during the Depression repaired, mended, and dry-cleaned garments that in better times they might have simply replaced. A man who owned one good suit and needed to keep it presentable for job interviews, church, and community functions could not afford to let it deteriorate. Dry cleaners found themselves with a steady stream of customers who were spending small amounts but spending consistently, keeping the industry solvent even as adjacent textile manufacturing collapsed. Number 20 was the pharmaceutical industry, and the survival story here is partly straightforward and partly surprising. People get sick regardless of economic conditions, and certain medications are not optional purchases. But what made the industry particularly resilient was the growth of over-the-counter patent medicines, tonics, and remedies that promised relief from the anxiety, exhaustion, and physical ailments that Depression-era Americans suffered in abundance. Companies like Bayer, which sold aspirin, and Vicks, with their VapoRub and other products, maintained strong sales. The medical profession itself was struggling, as many Americans could not afford doctors, and this actually drove more people toward self-medication with readily available products. The pharmaceutical industry would emerge from the Depression leaner, but fundamentally intact. Number 19 was the grocery industry, specifically the chain grocery store model, and this entry represents one of the most dramatic competitive shifts of the era. While independent mom-and-pop grocery stores struggled badly and thousands closed, the large chain grocers like A&P, Kroger, and Piggly Wiggly actually grew their market share during the Depression. The reason was ruthless simplicity. They could undercut independent stores on price through economies of scale, and in a depression, price was everything. A&P went from roughly 15 zero-zerant stores in 1929 to over 16 zero-zerants by the mid-1930s, even as thousands of independent competitors went under. The grocery chains understood before anyone else that in a downturn, the businesses that could offer the same thing cheaper would not just survive, they would accelerate. Number 18 was the seed and gardening supply industry, and if that surprises you, consider what happened across America in the early 1930s. Millions of families, including urban families who had never grown a vegetable in their lives, tore up their lawns and planted vegetable gardens. The federal government actively encouraged this through programs and pamphlets. Seed companies like Burpee saw enormous spikes in demand as Americans attempted to feed themselves through home production. Hardware stores that sold gardening tools, hoe handles, fertilizer, and seed packets found a customer base that was motivated by survival rather than leisure. And that kind of motivation creates very consistent purchasing behavior. If you want to grow your own food to feed your family this winter, you will find the money for seeds. If you have made it this far, leave a comment below telling me which of these industries surprised you the most so far, because we are just getting to the really interesting ones. Number 17 was the cosmetics industry, and this one has a name: the lipstick effect. Economists have documented it in multiple recessions, but it was the Great Depression that gave the phenomenon its clearest historical demonstration. When women cannot afford new dresses, new furniture, or new appliances, they buy lipstick. The price point is low enough to be justifiable. The psychological lift is immediate and real, and the product connects them to a sense of normalcy and self-care that the Depression constantly threatened to strip away. Sales of cosmetics held up remarkably well through the early 1930s, and companies like Revlon, which actually launched in 1932 at the absolute bottom of the Depression, found willing customers almost immediately. The timing seems insane until you understand human psychology. Number 16 was the movie industry, which is perhaps the most famous Depression-era survival story. For 10 cents, Americans could escape into a world of glamour, comedy, adventure, and romance for 2 hours. Weekly movie attendance actually peaked at around 90 million in the early 1930s, higher than it had been before the crash. Hollywood adapted brilliantly, producing escapist entertainment that offered relief from daily misery. Musicals exploded in popularity. Gangster films resonated with audiences angry at the economic establishment. The studios understood their audience with almost predatory precision, and they delivered exactly what broke, frightened, exhausted people needed. Theater owners, to their credit, found ways to make the experience even more attractive, offering dishes, door prizes, and double features to pull in customers who were carefully rationing their few discretionary cents. Number 15 was the beer and spirits industry, though with an important asterisk. Prohibition had been in effect since 1920, and it was the Depression-era economics that finally killed it. When the government realized it could tax alcohol and generate desperately needed revenue, Prohibition ended in 1933. The re-legalization of alcohol during the Depression was not a coincidence. It was a calculated fiscal decision. Breweries that had survived by producing near beer or converting to soft drinks and other products came roaring back, and alcohol sales in the first years after repeal were extraordinary. The industry had survived by going underground, by adapting, and ultimately by waiting for an economic and political moment when legalization became irresistible. Number 14 was the insurance industry, specifically life insurance, and its survival story is rooted in fear. The Depression did not make people feel more financially secure. It made them feel catastrophically insecure. Parents who had watched neighbors lose everything became intensely focused on any protection they could afford for their families. Surrendering a life insurance policy was one of the most painful things a family could do during the Depression, and millions resisted it until the absolute last moment. Insurance companies faced enormous pressure as policyholders borrowed against their policies, but the industry as a whole maintained a customer base that was motivated by some of the most powerful human emotions imaginable: fear of leaving a family destitute, desire to provide some certainty in an utterly uncertain world. Number 13 is where the list gets genuinely counterintuitive, and I need you to subscribe right now if you have not yet, because the next 12 entries go places that most people have never thought about. Number 13 was the automotive repair industry, and the logic is identical to the dry cleaning story. When you cannot afford a new car, you repair the one you have. Mechanics in the early 1930s found themselves busier than they had expected, as Americans who drove older vehicles kept bringing them in for repairs rather than trading up. A man who needed his car to travel to job interviews, to transport goods, or simply to maintain his sense of agency and mobility would find money for a critical repair that he would not have spent on the same car during prosperous times. The repair economy, across multiple industries, was one of the quiet success stories of the Depression. Number 12 was the public utility sector, meaning electricity and gas companies. Demand for basic utilities does not evaporate in a downturn. People still need heat. They still need light. And during the Depression, as more Americans stayed home to save money, home energy consumption, if anything, increased. Utility companies faced serious challenges collecting payments from unemployed customers, and many states intervened to prevent mass shutoffs, but the underlying demand for the product never faltered. The New Deal's rural electrification programs actually expanded the customer base of utility companies dramatically during the 1930s, bringing electricity to millions of rural Americans who had never had it, creating new revenue streams even in the middle of a catastrophic downturn. Number 11 was the professional boxing industry, which thrived in a way that seems both strange and entirely logical once you understand the cultural context. Boxing was cheap entertainment for spectators and offered a legitimate path to wealth for young men who had very few other options. The Depression produced one of the golden eras of professional boxing because it filled both supply and demand simultaneously. Young men from immigrant and working-class communities, facing no opportunities in the collapsing formal economy, turned to boxing in unprecedented numbers, creating a talent pool of extraordinary depth. Promoters found audiences eager for the visceral excitement of a sport where human struggle, will, and raw physical courage were on full display. Joe Louis began his professional career in 1934 as the Depression ground on, and his rise was inseparable from the era. Number 10 was the publishing industry for cheap periodicals, specifically pulp fiction magazines. In the 1920s, pulp magazines had already become a cultural institution, but the Depression accelerated their growth dramatically. For 10 or 15 cents, a reader could lose themselves in adventures, westerns, detective stories, romance, and science fiction. The pulps were not prestigious, but they were affordable and they were abundant. Titles like Black Mask, Weird Tales, and Amazing Stories published hundreds of thousands of copies per issue. The writers who filled those pages were, in many cases, genuinely talented people who had been squeezed out of higher-paying writing jobs and found refuge in the pulps. Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler both wrote extensively for pulp publications, and the hard-boiled detective genre they essentially invented was, in many ways, the literary voice of the Depression. Number 9 was the mail-order industry, anchored by giants like Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward. When people in rural and small-town America could no longer afford to travel to cities for goods, the mail-order catalog became more important than ever. Sears faced severe challenges during the Depression, but survived by aggressively cutting prices and expanding credit. The catalog remained a lifeline for rural Americans who needed goods that local stores could not provide. In a strange way, the Depression accelerated the mail-order companies' understanding of their customers, forcing innovations in pricing, credit, and selection that would position them well for the recovery years. The DNA of modern e-commerce, the idea of ordering from a catalog without visiting a physical store, was kept alive and strengthened during the Depression years. Number 8 was the children's toy industry for very inexpensive toys, and this entry touches on something profound about parental psychology during economic hardship. Parents who had lost nearly everything held onto one category of spending with fierce determination, a small toy or game for their child at Christmas or on a birthday. The emotional cost of seeing a child's face fall was, for many parents, worse than any financial pain. Companies that made cheap toys, board games, and simple amusements found a customer base that was reduced in spending but never entirely eliminated. Parker Brothers released Monopoly in 1935, and the timing was not accidental. A game that let you buy property, build houses, and accumulate wealth was precisely the fantasy that Depression-era Americans needed to play out on a cardboard board, because they could not play it out in real life. Number 7 was the luxury hotel industry. And I told you, number 7 would surprise you. Not every luxury hotel survived, of course. Many closed or dramatically reduced operations. But the very top tier of luxury hospitality, the Waldorf Astoria, the Plaza, the Grand Resort hotels of Florida and California, found a clientele that was not significantly diminished by the Depression. The reason is the profound bifurcation of the Depression's impact. For the bottom 80% of Americans, the Depression was a catastrophe. For the top 5%, it was, in many cases, a tremendous opportunity. Deflation meant that the rich could buy assets, services, and experiences at a fraction of their former cost. A first-class hotel room that had cost $50 a night in 1928 might cost $15 in 1932, making the luxury experience accessible to people of significant but not extraordinary wealth. The grandest hotels learned to market relentlessly to this narrowing but still solvent upper tier, hosting elaborate events, galas, and social functions that gave the wealthy a reason to spend in an atmosphere of deliberate, defiant splendor. Number 6 was the aviation industry, specifically commercial aviation, which was in its infancy in 1929 but grew remarkably through the early 1930s. This seems paradoxical until you understand that commercial aviation in that era was not a mass-market product at all. It was an elite service for business people, government officials, and the wealthy, and as we have established, those groups were not uniformly devastated by the Depression. Airlines like United, American, and TWA were receiving substantial government airmail contracts that provided a revenue floor independent of passenger ticket sales. The combination of government support and an elite customer base gave commercial aviation a stability that more democratically priced industries could not find. By the time the recovery arrived, commercial aviation had laid the infrastructure for rapid growth. Number 5 was the legal profession, and the Depression's impact here was deeply uneven. Lawyers who served wealthy clients, corporations, and the financial sector found that the Depression actually generated enormous amounts of work, because financial disaster is legally complex. Bankruptcies had to be processed, contracts renegotiated, assets liquidated, estates settled, and regulatory frameworks restructured. The New Deal alone created a generation of lawyers with full employment as they worked through the legal architecture of Roosevelt's programs. Meanwhile, lawyers who served ordinary people found their clients could not pay and suffered accordingly. The profession survived because its upper tier was insulated by the same forces that protected the luxury hotel industry. Number 4 was the firearms and ammunition industry, and the data here is striking. Gun sales in America did not collapse during the Depression. Rural Americans, in particular, continued to purchase firearms and ammunition because hunting was not a sport during the Depression, it was a food source. A man who could take a deer or shoot pheasants was a man who could feed his family through a winter when cash was almost entirely absent. The practical value of a firearm during the Depression was not about fear of crime or political anxiety, though those were present. It was about protein. Basic hunting ammunition was not an extravagance. It was an investment in food security, and families calculated it that way. Number 3 is the one that challenged my assumptions more than almost anything else I found in my research, and I promised you it would change how you think about hard times and human behavior. Number 3 was the self-improvement and education industry. Enrollment in American colleges and universities actually increased during the Depression. Public libraries reported their highest ever circulation numbers throughout the early 1930s. Correspondence courses, vocational training programs, and self-improvement books sold remarkably well. The explanation, once you see it, is obvious. People who have lost their jobs or fear losing them respond by trying to make themselves more valuable. The Depression created a hunger for skills, knowledge, and credentials that the education industry was positioned to satisfy. Night school enrollment at urban universities tripled in some cities. The idea that you could think and learn your way out of a bad situation was not just optimism, it was a survival strategy, and millions of Americans pursued it with genuine urgency. Number 2 was the federal government itself as an economic actor, meaning the industries that supplied it. When Franklin Roosevelt launched the New Deal beginning in 1933, he effectively created a new category of depression-proof economic activity. Construction companies that won contracts to build dams, bridges, post offices, and public buildings had federal paychecks behind their work. The cement industry, the steel industry for structural applications, the printing industry for the enormous volume of government documents and publications, and dozens of other sectors found that while their private sector business had evaporated, a new client with essentially unlimited credit had appeared. The New Deal did not save every industry, but it created a survival zone for companies nimble enough to pivot toward government contracts, and that pivot, in turn, shaped the modern relationship between American industry and the federal government in ways that persist to this day. And now, number 1, the single most counterintuitive survival story of the entire Great Depression. The industry that defies everything most people intuitively feel about how economic catastrophe should work. Number 1 was the cosmetics and personal care industry in its entirety, but more specifically, it was the men's grooming industry, the barber shops, the shaving cream manufacturers, the makers of hair tonic and aftershave. Here is why this is so extraordinary. Unemployment during the Depression peaked at 25%. Meaning 1 in 4 working-age Americans was actively looking for a job, and every single one of those 15 million men needed to look presentable for job interviews. The economics of personal appearance during the Depression were ruthlessly practical. A man who let himself go unshaven and unkempt signaled defeat, desperation, and unemployability. A man who kept himself groomed signaled discipline, self-respect, and readiness. Qualities that employers in a buyer's market for labor valued enormously. Barbershops charged 15 to 25 cents for a haircut at the depths of the Depression, and they stayed busy because men literally could not afford to look like they had given up. Gillette's safety razor business, the blade replacement model that required constant repurchase, proved virtually recession-proof for this reason. The Gillette Blue Blade, introduced in 1932 at the absolute nadir of the Depression, became one of the best-selling consumer products of the decade. Men who had given up restaurants, movies, new clothes, and 100 other expenditures drew a line at their own face. They would be broke, but they would be clean-shaven and respectable. This is not a small economic footnote. It is a profound window into human dignity. The Depression stripped away everything it could, but it could not strip away the desire to look like a man who had not been entirely defeated by circumstances. And an entire industry built its survival on that stubborn, beautiful refusal to surrender. Here is what the list of 25 industries that survived the Great Depression tells us. And I want you to sit with this for a moment because I think it matters beyond economic history. The industries that survived did not survive because they were lucky. They survived because they served needs that human beings refused to abandon, even under the most extreme pressure. The need for small pleasures, the need for escape, the need to feel clean and dignified, the need to protect their families, the need to learn and grow, and the need to hold on to some small piece of normalcy when the world has gone sideways. Harold Fletcher, the man we started with who lost everything at the bank in 1929, still bought his candy and still went to his barber and still listened to the radio at night. He was not being irrational. He was being human. And the industries that understood that, the ones that positioned themselves close to those unshakable human needs, found that even in the darkest economic moment in American history, people would find a way to pay them. The question I want to leave you with today is this. If another economic catastrophe arrived tomorrow, which of your spending habits would you fight the hardest to preserve? Leave that answer in the comments below, because I read every single one, and the answers reveal more about human nature than almost any economic data I have ever studied. If this video made you think differently about the Depression, the economy, or what people are really made of when things get hard, share it with someone who needs to hear it. We will see you in the next one.